Welcome everyone, my name is Pierre and I am the training coordinator for the ChildBright Network. Thank you for joining the final installment of our virtual symposium where we are excited to provide a platform to showcase some of the great work that our presenters are currently involved with. If you weren't able to join us for any of the previous 3 parts, feel free to visit ChildBright's YouTube channel where recordings of each of the presentations are available. Before we get started, I would just like to remind you to make sure that your microphones are muted and your cameras are turned off. If you have not joined us before, these presentations will typically run about 10 minutes in length and will be followed by a 5-minute Q&A period. To submit a question to the presenter, please navigate to the chat function within GoToMeeting and submit your query to the group as a whole. We will then go through these questions as they come up and direct them to the presenters as time permits. If you don't get to your question, feel free to connect with me afterwards and we can relay your query to the presenter offline.
So our first speaker today is Anton, who studies the use of resting state functional MRI to identify differences in brain activity and characterize its relationship with clinical symptoms in children who have experienced a periventricular venous infarct. So Anton, we make you the presenter, and then you can take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Pierre. Let me just share my screen. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my work here today. Thank you very much for joining in this rather unconventional format. I hope everyone's doing well and is staying safe during this time. As Pierre mentioned, my name is Anton Rogachev, and I'm a research fellow at the Children's Stroke Program at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. Now, contrary to what most people believe, yes, children can have strokes. In fact, pediatric stroke is one of the top 10 causes of death in children. And just like adults, stroke in children can come in all different forms with different etiologies occurring at different times throughout the child's development. Now, the stroke that I am interested in studying is known as perinatal stroke. And this is a stroke that occurs between 20 weeks of gestation and the 28th postnatal day, so the 28th day of life. Now, importantly, this type of stroke is the leading cause of unilateral cerebral palsy in children. Now, to take this one step further, a type of perinatal stroke that I am particularly interested in is known as periventricular venous infarct, or PVI for short. This type of stroke is notorious for causing damage to subcortical motor systems and spinal thalamic tract. So it really goes without saying that these children show impairments in motor skills. And compared to other stroke types, such as arterial ischemic stroke, little work has really gone into understanding the neurophysiological impairments in PVI, and thus there still exists really no reliable treatment option for these children. Therefore, in order to move in the direction of treatment discovery and exploration, it's really important to understand the neurobiological mechanisms in this disease model, but more importantly, to also investigate how they relate to the clinical motor impairments that these children present with. And this is exactly what we came to do here. Now, the study consisted of a cohort of 23 PI patients, 13 of whom were male, 10 of whom were female, with an average age of just under 12, and 22 typically developing children, 11 of whom were male and 11 of whom were female, with an average age of just under 13. And from all of these subjects, we acquired a resting state functional MRI scan. And for those of you who may not know, resting state functional MRI, as the name suggests, simply requires the subject to lay in the scanner at rest and not do anything and not to think of anything, while their ongoing spontaneous brain activity is being recorded. And what we did is we wanted to quantify brain activity, and we did this using a number of different metrics that probe not only activity on the local level or what's happening within a brain region, but also how different brain regions, different brain networks are communicating with each other. So the first metric that we looked at looks at the amplitude within a region, and this technique is known as the amplitude of low frequency fluctuations, or ALF for short. And we actually looked at the amplitude of these oscillations in different frequency bands. And once I get to the results section, you'll see that the results are actually divided up into the different frequency bands. Next, the approach that we took, the next metric that we looked at was regional homogeneity, or known as REHO for short. And really what REHO looks at, or really what it quantifies, is the local communication between a brain region and its nearest neighbors or its immediate adjacent regions. So you can think of this brain communication, but on a local level. Now, in addition to local communication, we also look at communication on a more global level, more widespread level. And to do this, we use two different metrics, the first of which is known as degree centrality. And degree centrality basically looks at the number of significant correlations that a brain region makes to the rest of the brain. So a high number of these significant correlations indicate a greater efficiency in the overall functioning of the brain. And finally, we also have functional connectivity, which is a metric used to quantify the strength of connections between brain regions or networks. Now, I'm not going to get into too much of the details of statistical analyses, but I just want you to know that they are in line with, oh, actually, before this statistical analysis, I realized that I missed this clinical motor assessment. So the clinical motor assessment, which we use, is known as the box and blot test. And this is basically a measure of unilateral manual dexterity, which is taken from both the affected and unaffected hand in these patients. And as I was getting to a few seconds ago, the statistical analysis is basically in line with what is most accepted in the field. And I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but I do want you to know that we did control for variables such as age, sex, and head motion. Now, before I get into the results, I would like to bit about the mask or the brain regions that we were interested in. Now, I want to remind you that because PVI seems to cause or is known to damage subcortical motor systems, I initially looked at brain activity within what I call the subcortical mask, which is shown here at the top right-hand corner and includes the thalamus and the basal ganglion. This other cortical gray matter mask was used for the last analysis, and I'll get to that in a bit. Now, in terms of the results themselves, so this upper portion here is the alpha or the amplitude analysis. And what I found was that consistently across the different frequency bands, which are known as slow wave 3, slow wave 4, and slow wave 5, we found that patients showed increased amplitude in the resting levels of brain activity. It seems to be primarily confined to the ipsilesional thalamus. Now, what's most interesting is, and what is shown in this bubble here, is that the abnormally high level amplitude or oscillatory abnormalities, specifically within the slow 5 frequency band, seem to be related to the motor performance of the affected hand within the patients, as shown in the scatter plot here, but not in the unaffected hand. And can you still hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, no, Anton, you're great.
Oh, okay, I'm good. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So now that we've quantified these impairments in amplitude on the local level, my next goal was to look at brain activity and brain connectivity on a more widespread level. Now, to do this, I use again two metrics: degree centrality and functional connectivity. And what I found was that PVI patients showed a decreased number, or they showed reduction in degree centrality, again in the primarily in the ipsilesional thalamus. So what this suggests is that they show a decreased number in the significant connections that the ipsilesional thalamus makes to the rest of the brain. And now that we see this decreased number in significant connections between the ipsilesional thalamus and the gray matter, my next question was to look at, well, to which cortical areas is there this disrupted functional connectivity from the thalamus? And this result here on the right-hand side seems to suggest that it is the functional connectivity between the thalamus and the medial prefrontal cortex that seems to be disrupted within these patients. So in conclusion, this work has characterized both local and cross-network brain functional abnormalities within children with PVI. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. Whoops. So on a local level, these patients show higher levels of resting oscillatory activity in the ipsilesional thalamus, And it's specifically the slow 5 oscillatory abnormalities that seem to correlate with motor performance, but only in the affected hand and not actually the unaffected hand, which is very interesting. And on a more global or cross-network level, we see that patients with PVI show a decreased number of significant functional connections between, in this area, the ipsilesional thalamus, and the cortex. And this disruption in functional connectivity is particularly between the thalamus and the medial prefrontal cortex of the hormone network. Now, this work is really in line with some recent publications in the field that have really demonstrated the importance of the thalamus in pediatric pathophysiology and suggest that perhaps targeting thalamic oscillations with some sort of neuromodulatory or neuromodulation technique may help to normalize brain activity and improve motor function in children with PVI. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you for walking us through all of that, Anton. So to the audience, my apologies. I was muted during the introduction at the start of the session today. So after the presentation, we typically open up for about 5 minutes of Q&A. So if you wanted to just ask Anton any direct questions, feel free to type it into the chat box, and then we will present it on the screen and ask Anton directly. To get us started, it's perhaps a basic question from my end, perhaps of the field of imaging. But how can I think you kind of alluded to that in your last point, but how can the findings from these imaging be applied in the clinic for children who have experienced PVI?
Right, and that's, I think, the million-dollar question. I think we're doing all this research, and ideally, at some point in the future, the goal is that we can really characterize these abnormalities in brain function and be able to revert them somehow. For example, with some sort of neuromodulation technique that will and as a result of doing this, we'll see an attenuation of clinical symptoms, or maybe even a reversal of them. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but if maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the road, if we're able to target these brain functions, reverse them, or maybe guide them more into the normative levels, and in order to reverse some of these clinical manifestations that we see.
Oh, and that's really cool. So it's sort of setting the stage for some future interventions where you can target those areas more directly.
Right.
So great. So as you can see, we are getting some questions on the board right now. The first is, were there any sex differences that you noticed in the cohort? And I believe you said you controlled for that.
Yes. So for sex difference, that's an excellent question. Before I answer this question, I'd like to know what sex differences you're referring to. Is it sex differences in clinical presentations or sex differences in brain activity? To answer the first question, I did not look at sex differences in brain activity because, as you may or may not have noticed, our cohort is not the largest. So further parsing it down by sex, we have about just around 10 for each sex in each group. So that analysis would be very, very interesting. However, I'm afraid it would be underpowered. So I don't know how much we would be able to take away from it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, so that's great. So increasing N, I guess, is always the answer, right?
Absolutely.
And then the other question we have from the audience as well is whether you considered any difference in terms of preterm infants with who have experienced PVI.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand whether any difference in terms of preterm infants.
So
I believe.
Yeah, so I interpret the question as whether their preterm infants were differently affected with a PVI, if that's the population that we're looking at.
Yes, so that's, no, I'm not unable to answer that question. I'm not sure how many of these patients were preterm or term.
Okay, all right.
Sorry about that.
Wonderful. So that might be a research question down the road.
Yeah, but something to look into, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Anton, and walking us through that work. And I really hope that we can be able to invite you back and get a bit of more of an update down the road.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you.